Good morning, readers. It's Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf. So it's about 6:25 on Sunday morning and I'm on my way into work, but I just thought while I drink my tea I would just record some of my thoughts on chapters 2 to 6 of Light in August, because if I don't do it now I'm pretty sure I won't feel like it when I get back from work, and then I will probably not do it at all. So apologies for the very informal video. I'm just literally holding my phone with the camera flipped the other way, and I've got some notes. And Brian's already posted his video and there were some really interesting discussions already on the comments of that. Alan hasn't posted his video yet, but I have the feeling that he said something about having trouble with some Wi-Fi, so maybe his video will come when he's resolved that. So there were a couple of overarching things that I wanted to mention. Firstly, it was about the prose. So last time I said that the pace of Light in August was a lot slower than perhaps I expected. It kind of really forces you to slow down, and the sentence structure I mentioned, it kind of, the important part of the sentence is sometimes kept back towards the end of the sentence, or it's not immediately apparent what the important part of the sentence is. I think that continues on into the actual structure of paragraphs and prose, particularly in chapter 2. So we've got the characters are then in the planing mill that Lena has been making her way towards, and the prose is almost like a spiral. Sorry, it's very early in the morning, sorry if my thoughts aren't particularly clear. It's like a spiral, so there's something that you don't know that it's important, and then every time you come back past it, the importance of it becomes more and more evident. For example, the fire. So Lena sees this while she's on her way into the planing mill. She sees this tower of smoke. We don't think that much of it, it's just part of the scenery. It's mentioned, so we assume it's got some kind of symbolism, but we don't necessarily know what it's about. And then every time that smoke is mentioned again, it becomes a bigger and a bigger deal until we gradually get to understand the importance of that smoke. Not until chapter 4, the end of chapter 4, do we actually understand fully what that smoke means. So I thought that was definitely very interesting. The other overall theme that I wanted to mention was about sort of outcasts and outsiders. So I think Brian already mentioned that this town is not very kind to outsiders, but the thing that I've noticed is that every character that we have met so far throughout these 6 chapters is an outcast or an outsider. So we've got Hightower, trained in some kind of priest's academy, and he decided to come to Jefferson specifically because of something that happened to his grandfather in the Civil War. I've noticed this quite a lot in American books, that there's always this kind of harping back to what happened in the Civil War. It's really important, and I think it always kind of reflects this idea that what happened in the past is somehow has a bearing on the present, has some kind of relevance and importance ongoingly to people's lives. Then we've got Byron. He's lived there for years apparently, but he still lives in a guest house, so he is still kind of outside society. He gets along with his colleagues pretty well, but he doesn't interact with them very much outside of work. So on Saturday evenings he works by himself, even though he's got no family to support with his extra earnings. It's just described as what he does. And then we have Christmas, obviously, as an outsider. Then Joe Brown, who is, we find out, Lucas Birch. He obviously moves from place to place. He's a little bit of a dodgy character. He's not embedded in any society very well. Then we've got Lena has obviously committed the social misdemeanor of having sex outside of marriage, and that makes her an outcast. Then we've got Miss Burden, who's the Yankee. So you can see the pattern here. We don't have a single character who is actually part of Jefferson, but we have a lot about Jefferson itself as a town, and the kind of exclusiveness of that community, and how the community is very reluctant to forgive people for their trespasses, forgive people for perceived sins and misdemeanors and errors. Even there's one line that's the community forgave her. I think it's about Hightower's wife. The community forgave her, and then it's it kind of points out that she hadn't actually committed any kind of crime, but it forgave her for the crime of not attending church or something like that. So just to go really quickly from chapter to chapter, doing all right for time so far. I think what's interesting in chapter 2, and it carries on throughout this section, is the time frames. So when chapter 2 opens with Joe, I think it opens with Joe Christmas arriving in the mill. It was one Friday morning, and it says 3 years ago, because we don't know where Byron is in time. We don't know where Joe Christmas is in time. And initially, I had this thought of is Joe Christmas Lucas Birch? Even though I should have known this because I have read this book before, I did initially have that thought. And it's kept quite vague as to time, until step by step we realise this other person arrives who is Joe Brown, and the way that time progresses, it is not necessarily clear, and because of that, it increases the suspense. That continues in later chapters. For example, in chapter 5, we've got Joe wandering around the town, and I definitely had this question of, like, is this before the fire, or is this his reaction to the fire? And I think it is supposed to be before the fire, but it's an interesting jump in time to go back from having just revealed all about the fire to then go back to just before the fire, and without making that clear. It's very interesting. So yeah, in chapter 2, we've got Lena arriving at the planing mill and Byron being like, wow, I thought I'd be safe in the planing mill on a Saturday afternoon, but actually it's where he meets Lena, and I have a feeling that that relationship is probably not going to work out very well for him. Then chapter 3, we've got this kind of like time shift again back into Hightower's story. So what I get the feeling with all these time zone shifts is it's like we're on the surface of the story, which is the present day, and then we keep getting taken like down into like caves that are the backstory of each character. There's like different openings into the past on the surface of the present, and we keep getting led by Faulkner down into these different histories. What I couldn't help but think about with Hightower was the character of Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird. So Boo is the outcast and sometimes kind of like seen as the Mockingbird character, where people ostracize him because of an event that happened quite a long time in the past, and because of the reaction of his immediate family to that as well. And I felt that was very applicable to Hightower too. He's lived in this community for such a long time, and it even says like who knows what he's seen, and very few people go and visit him. It's interesting to me that Byron is the person that goes and visits him, because it's like, where did that relationship come from? It doesn't actually explain why it was that Byron was like, oh yeah, I've heard of all of this story about Hightower, but I'll just pop in on an evening and see how he's doing. So I'd be interested to hear why that is. One thing that really struck me in chapter 3 was the racism in the text. There's a very casual portrayal of all of the African American character figures, not even like necessarily specific characters, as being very dim or very slow. Like, it's a consistent undermining of their perceived intelligence. And Brian was talking about paternal racism. I think maybe my understanding of the word paternal was a little bit different. I didn't think that paternal would be as bad as it is, if that makes sense. I think possibly because my understanding of paternal racism in a more like present day sense is not quite as overtly critical and quite as overtly like undermining of the people that it impacts. Even though it's still a very bad thing, it's not as strongly put as it is here in Faulkner's words. And I do have to think about like how that impacted on his development of the character of Christmas. If he had that like deep held belief that people of an African American background were less intelligent, whether that impacts the character that he created that is of this mixed race heritage. Then chapter 4, we've got the fire story. That's where this kind of spiral thing really kicks in, because it's like, it really builds the suspense that we keep coming back to this idea that something has happened in this fire. And we get these repeated references to Miss Burden, and there's even a moment where it's like, I think Hightower's like, did they get out all right? Like, is Miss Burden okay? And Byron's like, they got out, Brown and Christmas, but it's like Brown and Christmas is the start of the next sentence, so it's not actually clear what's happened to Miss Burden. And then we get this reference later on of, oh, there was a fire and Miss Burden got hurt, and then it's not until right at the end of the chapter that we really find out what's happened to Miss Burden, which is something quite brutal. So things are kind of repeated and built upon every time. And it's about the kind of like gradual formation of opinions, and like seeing what people say and how they say it changes the way that each person kind of thinks. So like, Hightower gradually realises that Byron's fallen in love with Lena, and then it talks about whether or not Byron realises it. In chapter 2, it talks about he didn't realise yet that he was falling in love with her. So it's interesting in that sense that it talks about like how people's feelings develop on different topics. One thing that's interesting at the end of chapter 4 is that Joe Brown is being accused of a crime, and he accuses in turn Joe Christmas. So Joe Christmas is this character who, it has been suggested by hints in the text, has got a mixed racial heritage. Meanwhile, Joe Brown, who is actually Lucas Birch, is also described as being dark complected. So it's not entirely clear like what his background is, but they're both outsiders and they're both not exactly liked in the town. He accuses Joe Christmas of essentially committing murder, and it's kind of like, well, prove it from the town, and they are kind of suggesting that Joe Brown has committed this crime. And then Joe Brown accuses Joe Christmas of being not white, and that is seen, it's not like, wrongfully accusing him of murder is not seen as like a bad thing, but wrongfully accusing him of being not white, it's like, whoa, do you have evidence for this? You know, like, we're going to take this allegation seriously, and if it turns out not to be true, you're going to get into trouble for this false accusation. That was how I interpreted it. The other thing that's interesting about, like, the way that the narrative is handled in this chapter is that all of these events are recounted, and they're quite dramatic events. There's a fire, there's accusations of murder, there is a murder, very dramatic events that happen, but they are all told to us through Byron's perspective, and that happens repeatedly at times. Like, we get Hightower's story through the point of view of a town person telling it to Byron, and we get it alternatively from a different point of view as it's recounted to somebody else. And it's like, one of the key pieces of advice that people give to writers these days is show, don't tell. But actually, this is Faulkner doing the opposite. This is Faulkner telling, not showing. And it actually contributes a lot to the suspense, because it keeps the pace slow, but it allows for a lot of these like references to what's coming. It allows for him to keep on saying, oh, there's a problem, or, you know, like, I'm going to be the one that's going to have to tell you this awful thing, but it holds the awful thing back. So I found that quite interesting as well. I feel like that's my most used phrase this morning. I found that quite interesting. So chapter 5 is based on the perspective of Joe Christmas, and like I've said, it's kind of in a bit of a weird time zone of its own, but we think it's before the fire, and he wanders around the town, and he's kind of making preparations for leaving or for doing something. He's quite violent towards Joe Brown, who he lives with, like serious warnings for violence on this book. There's kind of most kinds of violence that you can imagine. It's quite a graphic book at times, so just bear that in mind. The way that Joe's thought processes go in this chapter, it's kind of like, I've written in my notes, suggestion of literary madness, because it's not like madness that is actually a mental health condition as we would understand it today, but it is madness as madness is commonly portrayed in literature, where he is kind of going from one event to the next, and he's got this kind of fixated idea of something is going to happen, something is going to happen. And because of this slight obsession, I think somebody in the comments was talking about, on Brian's video, was talking about like the idea of the importance of obsession in the book. This obsession kind of like builds towards a point where we can tell that he's going to do something quite drastic. And there's a moment where he's like standing naked outside Miss Burden's window, and I think that in itself is what we would see as evidence of madness, but not like mental health, but just like a book's interpretation of madness, and that reflects on the character and what the character is likely to do, the kind of like unpredictability that sets up. So the other thing that happens in chapter 5 is he wanders through areas of town he wanders through the freedman area, which is so the African American neighborhood, and he wanders through the white neighborhood, and he is obviously not at home in either of those areas. So it really emphasizes the otherness of the character of Joe Christmas with his mixed heritage. One neighborhood is portrayed as very, very dark and very kind of like sinister, which is obviously the black neighborhood, the neighborhood of the African Americans, and the white neighborhood is presented as being very bright. There are like references to lights inside windows, but inaccessible to Joe Christmas. So it's like the neighborhood that he belongs in, according to kind of Faulkner's eyes, but also it seems to be from Joe Christmas's own interpretation, and the neighborhood that he wants to be in, but he just never quite gets that acceptance in the white community. I think today we would kind of refer to this as something called passing, like disguising of your racial heritage to fit in with the kind of dominant race, I suppose. Sorry if my kind of vocabulary on this is not exactly right. Moving on to chapter 6, we've got this kind of questioning of memory and the reliability of memory at the start of the chapter, which is phrased in a very interesting way. Memory believes before knowing remembers, believes longer than recollects. And it's kind of, it makes us question whether these things actually happen to Joe Christmas or whether they're kind of like a presented memory. It just makes you kind of like question the perspectives of the characters when they're looking back so far in time, which they frequently are so far in the book. And it's about Joe as a 5-year-old at an orphanage. He's at a white orphanage. Somebody has left him on the doorstep at Christmas, of the doorstep of a white orphanage, and it's like somebody, his mum presumably knowing his heritage, wants to put him on the one side of his heritage and not the other, so back to that idea of kind of passing. And he seems to go unnoticed in that people just see him as a normal child. They don't question which orphanage he should be in, because at the time they were quite strictly segregated. And the children seem to recognise this. The children call him racial slurs, but the adults don't seem to really pay attention to this until he goes and he steals this toothpaste, and he becomes like black when he is caught in a morally ambiguous situation. The dietitian catches him, and her immediate reaction is to start racially abusing him, like verbally racially abusing him. This kind of toothpaste scene, there's been kind of some discussion in the comments. I can't help, like when I first read it, I was like immediately, that's quite a sexual thing to put from the point of view of a 5-year-old child. And then the dietitian comes in and she actually starts having sex or having some kind of sexual interaction that doesn't sound strictly consensual on the bed while he's hidden behind this curtain. And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe the toothpaste is sexual because there's this obvious implication there. There is some mirroring between Joe behind the curtain and Joe outside the window of Miss Burden's. I was talking about that in the comments on Brian's video, which kind of enhances that still. But it also shows like his vulnerability. So when he's naked by the window, in a way, his nakedness makes him vulnerable. And when he is hidden behind this curtain, he is vulnerable as well as a child. And he's found it causes some tension, and eventually the janitor, who, I don't know, maybe his dad? Is that, just too obvious? Tries to take him out and tries to put him again into a different white orphanage to avoid the fact that he's been, like you could say, discovered in this orphanage. So again, trying to enable him to pass. I've written in my notes like the white savior trope, the idea of like a white man trying to like resolve the problems of a black man. But it's almost like this white savior idea is kind of rejected by Joe when he is supported by somebody to pass. I don't know, it's like it doesn't work in a simplistic way, but I don't know that much about that trope, so I don't know whether I'm kind of interpreting it rightly. Even at this age, even age 5, Joe is like weirdly quiet, and that's the thing that stands out about him when he gets to the planing mill, is he's like weirdly quiet and not very interactive with other people that he works with. And even age 5, that still carries on. So we get this idea that there is some kind of innate nature there that I think comes from Faulkner's views on race, Faulkner's personal views on race. And then, yeah, going back to that toothpaste, there is this old English folk song that goes, "Let no man steal your time," as in the herb, and it basically means, don't have sex, don't fall in love. And it's like here, I've written down, "Let no man steal your toothpaste." It's like the suggestion of, I don't even know how to phrase it, that the toothpaste is this kind of forbidden fruit, and it's like pink and moist and luscious, and it like is really strongly linked to this female character, and it's problematic for the woman that somebody is sneaking in, stealing her toothpaste. So I've really enjoyed this so far. I've made this very long, so I'm sorry about that, but thank you for watching if you have. Thank you very much for Brian for his video. I'm looking forward to seeing what Alan has to say about these chapters, and take care, have a nice day. I'm going to head into work.